Welcome to the second part of our documentary on the 100 Years' War. In the first part of the documentary we talked about multiple reasons that made this conflict inevitable. The initial phase of this war, battles of Sluys, Crécy and Poitiers, and the peace treaty signed in Brittany that ended the first stage of the hostilities. Let's dive into the events of the second phase of the war. This is Kings and Generals documentary series. Although England and France signed the peace treaty in Brittany in 1360, a proxy war for the succession of Duchy of Brittany continued. In 1364, English-backed John of Montfort defeated French candidate Charles of Blois and became the Duke, but as Edward III rescinded his claim to the French throne, the new Duke had to pay homage to French King Charles V. Therefore, this tactical victory didn't give England any strategic advantage, while French gained an experienced new commander in Bertrand du Guesclin, who previously fought for Charles of Blois. Du Guesclin joined King's army and his strategic talent dominated the next 15 years of the war. French and English interests clashed once again in Castile, as France, emboldened by the peace, decided to install a king more loyal to their interests. The fact that French King John II, who was in English captivity since the Battle of Poitiers, died in 1364, allowed new King Charles V some freedom of action. In 1366, Charles ordered Bertrand du Guesclin to gather a new army. In the same year, du Guesclin's army invaded Castile and Henry of Trastamara was placed on the throne. Pedro the Cruel, who lost his crown, fled to English-held Aquitaine and asked English heir Edward the Black Prince for assistance in exchange for land in Castile. Edward invaded in 1367 and restored Pedro to power. However, latter refused to make good on his promise and English troops returned to Aquitaine. That wasn't the end of this adventure, as Henry of Trastamara returned to Castile in 1369, murdered Pedro and became the king. He then signed a treaty with France and promised that his fleet will help French. King Charles V was inspired by the strategic advantages he gained in Brittany and Castile, and he was eager to take all the lands held by English on the continent. On the other hand, Black Prince didn't gain anything from his invasion of Castile and had to raise taxes in Aquitaine and nearby counties. That was creating a natural disturbance in these lands, especially among aristocracy not used to be taxed so severely, and they started sending complaints to the French king. Charles V lost his suzerainty over Aquitaine, but his lawyers cited the fact that Edward III didn't denounce his claim to the French throne in a certain fashion. French king got a legal cause to summon Black Prince to Paris to answer to the complaints, and this triggered the second phase of the 100 Years' War that historians call Caroline in honor of the French King Charles. He learned from the mistakes of his predecessors and created a small professional army and appointed Bertrand du Guesclin the Constable of France in 1370, basically the military leader of all French forces. This was something never seen before, as this post was usually reserved for the most prominent aristocrats of the kingdom. The most notable English commander of the age, John Chandos, was killed soon after conflict started, which didn't help. English forces had one more problem. Throughout the war they employed a medieval tactic called chevauchée, which called for burning and pillaging of enemy territory by making swift cavalry raids. That made French populace hate English. The war began to unify French into one nation. People of France resisted occupiers at every turn, and this new situation made the life of English forces even more difficult. As soon as hostilities started anew, Edward III sent a new army led by Robert Knowles, which landed at Calais in August 1370. This army attempted a chevauchée through the central France in order to join the forces of the Black Prince in Aquitaine, but du Guesclin correctly predicted their route. Army led by him had 4,000 men and started to pressure Knowles from the north, while smaller force, 1,200 strong, was moving against Englishmen from the east. Knowles decided to retreat to Brittany in order to avoid being surrounded, but his captains were eager to raid and loot, and that divided English army. Knowles and his retinue marched west to Brittany, while more than 5,000 Englishmen stayed in the Loire Valley. Du Guesclin arrived to Le Mans on 3rd December, and his scout reported that English forces were spread in the area. Although his troops were tired from the forced march and weather wasn't suitable, he decided to attack. That paid off, as English army had no idea that du Guesclin was in the area and were completely unprepared. French forces killed more than 5,000 enemies on 4th December near Pontvallain and only lost a few hundred. Most English commanders were captured or killed. The myth that English army was invincible in the open field was debunked, and it helped the morale of French troops. Shortly after, French army took Poitou and Saintonge from the Black Prince, who was too ill and had to return to England. Edward III decided to send another army in 1372 to help defend Aquitaine. This time it was sent directly to the duchy by the sea. However, United Franco-Castilian fleet destroyed English navy on June 22, 1372, near the city of La Rochelle. This was a big blow to England. Not only did they lose almost 50 ships and 10,000 soldiers, but their naval dominance was at an end, and it became impossible for them to send any help to the surrounded Aquitaine. Still, du Guesclin continued employing Fabian tactic of attacking enemy supply lines and rearguard, and tried to stay away from the large engagements. He won a series of small battles between years 1372 and 1380, and this allowed French to regain most of the occupied territory. In 1375, Pope Gregory XI tried to facilitate the peace conference in Bruges. In 1376, the Black Prince died of his long-term illness, and his father, the King Edward III, passed away in 1377, and due to that, peace talks fell through in the same year. Edward was succeeded by his grandson Richard II. The new king was just 10 years old, and the kingdom was weak from decades of war. As Franco-Castilian alliance now ruled the seas, they raided southern England from 1377 to 1380, and these raids were also led by du Guesclin. Unfortunately for French, their momentum was stalled, as both their king Charles V and du Guesclin died in 1380. King was succeeded by his son Charles VI, who was just 11. By that time, France had most of its territory back, and English only held Calais, Cherbourg, Brest, Bordeaux, Bayonne, and the land surrounding these cities. Despite the fact that aristocracy in both countries wanted to continue fighting and wasn't content with the current status quo, it wasn't possible, as internal situations weren't stable, new kings were young, and revolts created tumultuous situations in both countries. England was hit by the peasant revolt of Wat Tyler in 1381. A perpetual state of war enriched the feudal elite of the kingdom, but the serfs were bearing the brunt of the taxation needed for this war. Attempt to collect unpaid taxes triggered the uprising in Essex, and it rapidly spread across the southeast of the country. Although it was suppressed quickly and the number of casualties was low for that time period, English aristocracy was now worried that peasantry may rise again. They had to keep some troops in their holdings, and that hindered any war effort. France also wasn't in the best shape despite recent victories. Kingdom was ravaged by war and death toll due to the plagues. King Charles VI was young and his uncles ruled the kingdom, and they were interested in their personal gain more than the fortunes of the country. French aristocracy in general was very worried that influence and prestige of the Valois kings were on the rise. The centralization of the kingdom would weaken them, so they were interested in limiting the power of the king. On the other hand, cities in Flanders revolted again in 1382. This rebellion had to be suppressed. The battle between king forces and the Flemish town led by Ghent happened in the same year in Rysbeck. King's forces won, but overall situation in the kingdom was discouraging. Any attempts to take over the remainder of the English territory on the continent. Revolts happened in Rouen and Paris in 1382, and they basically prevented effective taxation. Charles VI brought the end of the regency in 1388, while Richard II did the same in 1389. Unlike the feudal elites, both kings were eager to finally stop the hostilities and have peace. Negotiations started in June of 1389 in the town of Lenungham, just outside of Calais. France was represented by the king's uncles, led by the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold. This party was trying to limit king's power, so they negotiated conditions accordingly. Aquitaine had to be returned to England, Calais was to stay under the English rule, France had to pay 1.5 million francs of indemnity, and the King of England was to become the vassal of the French king through the Duchy of Aquitaine. The last clause showed that French aristocrats were eager to gain one more powerful feudal in France in order to hold the centralization process. A 3-year truce was also agreed upon. Diplomats returned to their kings, and while French side approved the treaty quickly, English Parliament disagreed, citing the possibility that the King of France would have influence over his vassal, the Duke of Aquitaine. The peace wasn't signed, but it was de facto enacted. In 1395, French ambassadors negotiated with Richard II personally. It was agreed that he would marry the daughter of Charles VI and received 800,000 francs of dowry for her. Richard also promised to leave Brest and Cherbourg, and both kings decided that they will start a joint crusade against the Ottoman invasion in the Balkans. This concluded the second phase of the 100 Years' War, the Caroline War. Both sides were battered, the feudal elite in both kingdoms wasn't content, so inevitably war restarted in 1403. In coming weeks we will conclude the documentary series on the 100 Years' War, as we will talk about the Lancastrian War, Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, and Joan of Arc. So, press that precious subscribe button to get updates. Thank you for watching, we are very grateful for your likes, shares and comments. This was Nurix and Phoenix channel with another Kings and Generals documentary, and we will catch you on the next one.